A ascensão e queda do comunismo foi um dos fenômenos históricos de maior impacto no século XX, com efeitos até hoje. Há pouco mais de 20 anos, metade da Europa era governada por partidos marxistas-leninistas. Agora, nenhum país europeu adota o sistema. E os partidos que defendem a ideologia mal conseguem adesões ou votos. O comunismo surgiu como promessa de utopia, arrastou-se como prática totalitária e implodiu como um prédio de fundações apodrecidas, debilitado por suas próprias contradições, seus erros de execução e suas impossibilidades teóricas. Em outras partes do mundo, 1/5 da humanidade ainda vive sob o comunismo, sobretudo por conta da populosa China, onde o partido com o monopólio do poder se diz comunista, embora a economia siga as leis do mercado. Essa forma diluída do regime, com economia capitalista, mas partido único que se diz marxista, também sobrevive no Vietnã e no Laos. Ao estilo totalitário, o comunismo revela seus piores defeitos na Coreia do Norte, onde penúria e fome da classe operária convivem com privilégios de um líder supremo tratado como Deus, um país ateu que se diz paraíso proletário. O comunismo sobrevive também em Cuba, em estilo tropical, repleto de jeitinhos latinos para sanar as falhas estruturais, e prossegue sob tratamento intensivo, respirando com a ajuda de aparelhos. O comunismo tem sido o foco de estudos do historiador britânico Archie Brown há 40 anos, quase todos passados como professor da Universidade de Oxford. Autor de vários trabalhos sobre o assunto, inclusive 2 livros que focam o período reformista de Mikhail Gorbachev, Archie Brown acaba de lançar Ascensão e Queda do Comunismo, que em 720 páginas descreve e analisa o que o título promete, de Marx a Fidel. O Milenio entrevistou Archie Brown na sua casa em Oxford, interior da Inglaterra. Let's start at the end and deal with the political question that divides political analysts to this day. Did communism implode in the Soviet Union because of internal problems? It was rotten, incapable of reforming, the economic situation was terrible, or did it happen under pressure from outside, especially military spending of the Americans, Star Wars programs of that kind? What was the main reason?
Well, there were so many reasons why communism ended when it did, but I don't think the main one was American military spending. Indeed, Reagan's arms build-up in his first term and his aggressive policy during that first term strengthened the hardliners in the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev didn't come to power because he was seen in any sense as a soft liner. He came to power because he was the youngest member of the Politburo and in the strongest position to succeed after the series of old men who had died in office. I think a great deal depended on internal developments within the Soviet Communist Party. There was, of course, the attraction of the West, but it wasn't primarily pressure of military build-up that caused this change.
It broke up for internal reasons, to sum up.
Mainly for internal reasons, but the fact that the Soviet political elite, party intellectuals, traveled to the West and saw for themselves the difference in the standard of living and also the greater freedom of Western countries, this had an impact over time.
You have an interesting thesis. One of your main theses in your book is that Gorbachev chose to reform the country, the political side of communism, rather than the economic side, as the Chinese have been doing. And but by doing that, he took away the monopoly of power. He also refused to adopt repressive measures. So he ended up losing political control, didn't he?
He did. He wanted economic reform as well, but economic reform was much more difficult in the Soviet Union than in China, for example. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, terrible though it was, had destroyed the Chinese bureaucracy. In the Soviet Union, there were tremendous bureaucratic obstacles to economic reform, and so Gorbachev gave priority to political reform, partly to facilitate economic reform, but increasingly for its own sake. He came to really believe in political reform and in a process of gradual democratization. And it's true that he undermined the power of the Communist Party, but by 1989 he was consciously doing this. He had come to the conclusion that the monopoly of power of the Communist Party and the strict discipline within it was incompatible with democracy, and he was increasingly becoming a Democrat.
That's a big transition from somebody who made his career in the Communist Party and rose to this high position. He got picked to be the leader of the party. But was the way he thought about communism when he reached that position in 1985 the same as in the end? Or did he, along the way, came to the conclusion that things were lost anyway?
Yes. From the very beginning, Gorbachev was a reformer, and he continued to think of himself as a socialist, but he moved from being a communist reformer to being a socialist of a social democratic type. And that happened while he was actually in office as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. So he couldn't announce to the world that he was a social democrat, but within his own small circle of colleagues and advisors, he did say that he felt very close to social democracy. He felt very much at one with Willy Brandt when he was speaking to him, the president of the Socialist International, and with Felipe González, the Spanish prime minister at the time, who was his favorite foreign politician.
The system crumbled, and by the end of 1981, the Soviet Union no longer existed. But could communism have existed, have continued a little bit longer at least, perhaps not forever, as they always claimed, but a bit longer? It didn't have to end at that time, could it?
I think that communism in the Soviet Union and by extension in Eastern Europe could have lasted several decades longer. In a sense, it was reform which produced crisis rather than crisis that produced reform. The Soviet Union had many problems in 1985, but it wasn't in deep crisis. It was in deep crisis 5 years later, and that was the result of reform. So if another Brezhnev, another Andropov had taken office in 1985, the system could have continued for quite a while longer.
When you mentioned that Gorbachev gave priority to the political reform rather than the economic reform, did he have a choice? Couldn't he have tried to change the economy that wasn't capable of producing a decent refrigerator, for instance? He was actually falling apart in terms of the quality of life of the Soviets.
It wasn't easy to introduce economic reform in the Soviet Union. There were a whole lot of economic ministries, there were party organs in charge of the economy, there were factory managers up and down the country who were embedded in that system. I think it was a very difficult thing to do. And if you moved to market prices, then of course prices would go up, prices of many essentials. And so it was difficult. It possibly could have been done, but it was easier in China, where you simply had to liberate the peasants and let them grow what they wanted to grow. But China was an overwhelmingly peasant country, and by this time Russia was not. So the conditions are just very different in the Soviet Union. It may be that if Gorbachev had given total priority to economic reform, he could have got away with it. But I have some doubts about that.
As you said, in different circumstances, it could have lasted decades longer, communism in Europe. But could he have ended earlier than the period when it did, from 89 to 91? Well, after all, and just as a reminder to our viewers, we had a revolt in Eastern Germany in 1953, Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, Poland from 79 on. Still, it continued.
Communism in Eastern Europe could have ended very much earlier. What kept it going, of course, was the determination of the Soviet Union to sustain these regimes in East Central Europe. If people in Eastern Europe had not understood that behind their own unpopular rulers stood the might of the Soviet army, and the Soviet Union ready and willing to use whatever means it took to maintain communist rule there, it would have ended far earlier. You mentioned the cases of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany. Possibly only in Bulgaria would communism have continued longer without this Soviet threat in the background. So as long as the Soviet Union had the determination to intervene to sustain these communist regimes, they would have continued.
So brutal repression is actually what kept it in place.
It was repression. It was also, of course, some carrot as well as stick. Usually after there was some unrest in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union would pour a lot of money in to try to improve the standard of living. This happened in Czechoslovakia in the early 1970s, for example, and Poland cost the Soviet Union a great deal of money. But in the final resort, it was a willingness to use force.
We mentioned the role of Gorbachev there, but what other personalities we could pick out that had some influence, or what influence did personalities like Pope John Paul II, Lech Wałęsa in Poland, even Ronald Reagan with the extreme right wing in the U.S. putting pressure, how much did these people contribute to the overall change that took place?
Well, when Ronald Reagan died, the American newspapers said, you know, this is the man who ended communism. And I think that's a gross exaggeration, that Reagan's policy, hardline policy, in some ways helped to strengthen the hardliners in the Soviet Union. It's also misunderstanding Reagan, who thought of himself as a peacemaker, not a warmonger. And he made several overtures to Soviet leaders during his first term and was rebuffed. He couldn't have any meetings with them because, as he said, these guys keep dying on me. And so he finally found somebody he could talk to with Gorbachev, and they came to some serious agreements. But the really important figure here was Gorbachev, not Reagan. Reagan coincided with 4 Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernyenko, and Gorbachev, and nothing changed for the better, whether in East Europe or in East-West relations, until Gorbachev came along. As for Pope John Paul II, to have a formidable pope emerging from an East European country was a source of spiritual solace and political inspiration for many people in Eastern Europe, especially Poland. But again, without the changes in the Soviet Union, he couldn't have done it.
When we look at the picture of communism in the world today, you know, when it's finished in Europe. Even the communist parties that are left over have practically no influence at all. But it still exists in countries like North Korea, in China, obviously, with its own characteristics. Still in Asia, we have Vietnam and Laos, and Cuba, of course, closer to us in Brazil. I would imagine different reasons explain the survival of all these systems, but do you think there's also a common element that justifies them still being around?
I think one common element is patriotism, and the fact that the communist regimes have been able to play this patriotic card. Very often the enemy has been the United States. I mean, very obviously in the case of North Korea, but equally obviously in the case of Cuba. For a long time that was true of China as well, though of course now China and the United States have got rather a close relationship of economic interdependence. So I think that's one factor, that the successful communist regimes have managed to play the national or even nationalist card to some effect.
You went to China this year, you were telling me, and you describe in your book, you describe the system in China as a hybrid system. Obviously a mixed economy, almost like state capitalism, considering that half the economy is already in private hands. Still, the Communist Party has a monopoly of power there. But is that enough to characterize China as a communist country still?
Well, it depends which of the defining characteristics you want to put most emphasis on. I think there's just enough to call it communist, because the Communist Party does have a monopoly of power. It's got strict discipline, the so-called democratic centralism. I mean, that's what went under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. The party became a kind of debating society. That hasn't happened in China. At the same time, there is some real intellectual discussion within the Chinese Communist Party, and there is discussion of political reform, but partly they're very wary of the Soviet experience. After all, in the Soviet Union it ended with the disintegration of the Soviet state, and so even people in China who would like political reform don't want to finish up in that Soviet predicament.
Communism in Africa, countries like Angola and Mozambique, which were at one stage were under Communist Party control, was that simply a byproduct of the Cold War? Because as soon as the Cold War ended, you know, there went communism in these countries.
I think it was largely a product of the Cold War, that the small elites in these countries could appeal either to the Soviet Union or to the United States and get support and get material help. And there were some people there who believed that they were Marxists or Leninists, and they also saw that Leninism was one way of maintaining an authoritarian control in a country. But there wasn't the mass base for a communist system. Even in the Soviet Union, some of the party intellectuals said, well, we call these countries states of socialist orientation, but they're not ready for even a first stage of socialism. So on the whole, I think these so-called communist regimes in Africa were nothing of the kind.
Moving back a bit in history and in time, if we do look questions that might puzzle, especially the younger generations, who keep asking around when they hear about communism, what was the attraction? What led so many people to dedicate their lives to the cause, some of them dying for the cause of communism?
Well, there's no getting away from the fact that a lot of people joined the Communist Party in many countries for the most idealistic reasons. Once a Communist Party was in power, joining the party meant you improved your career prospects. But that was very far from being the case in an authoritarian right-wing regime. You were much more likely to be imprisoned, exiled, or killed. And even in a democratic country, joining the Communist Party could lead to some social isolation. So you had to have some deep beliefs, and many people believed that they were going to build a fairer society, a just society, get rid of the gross inequalities and injustices of capitalism. Of course, the trouble is, once they joined the party, then they had to go along with whatever was the Soviet line, and they soon found themselves making all sorts of compromises. But the initial joining of the party was often from the purest of motives.
Outside the countries, outside the communist countries, the intelligentsia admired the system for quite a while, even when stories were coming out of strong repression, the gulags in the Soviet Union, strong censorship, the monopoly of power, the mistreatment of people, the inefficiency of the economy. Still, there was a reluctance to believe those facts. Why do you think the West, to call it that way, was so reluctant to accept what was happening?
It varies from country to country. That for many intellectuals, Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, when he denounced some of the crimes of Stalin, was an eye-opener, and a lot of people left the Communist Party and became more anti-communist. In France, for example, it wasn't until Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, was published in the 1970s that French intellectuals stopped believing in the Soviet Union, and a lot of them became ultra-critical. So it was quite curious that the way in which intellectuals refused to look at the evidence when it was already available until very late in the day.
That kind of reminds of another Marxist, in this case, Groucho Marx, who said that, who do you want to believe, me or the evidence in front of your eyes?
Yeah.
It seems to be that case. They didn't want to believe the evidence in front of their eyes.
That's right, yes. And that worked, the Groucho Marx remark worked for Gorbachev, because he said that what he saw with his own eyes when he came to the West for the first time, when he visited Western Europe, Italy, France, that was when he realized the gulf between Soviet propaganda and what life was actually like in Western Europe.
Criticism of what was happening in the communist countries was to play the game of the right wing, or to play the game of the imperialists, of the Washington. And that argument seemed to hold water for quite a while, didn't it?
It did, but it was always possible to be critical of American foreign policy and many aspects of the United States, and be critical of the Soviet Union as well. After all, in Western Europe, over many years, the main alternative to communism, especially the main appeal to working class voters, was that of social democratic parties. And in many countries, Scandinavia, certainly Britain, West Germany, socialists of a social democratic type were far more popular than the communists. So this was an alternative that was neither the system of the United States or unquestioning support for American foreign policy, nor was it being uncritical of the Soviet Union. So there were alternatives. It's not an either-or.
We do see still a lot of the old type of resistance along those lines in Latin America, for instance, in relation to Cuba, where a substantial segment of the intelligentsia or the left refuses to accept criticism of Cuba beyond the obvious, oh, the country has economic problems. So the existence of a common, clear enemy, it's continuously an argument to defend the system.
Yes, and this was especially so during the Cold War. I mean, Cuba, of course, has got its achievements, not least in its health service, but why that should lead one to defend authoritarian rule is another question. And, you know, I would come back to the view that Cuba could have preserved some of its achievements, but also liberalized the system quite a bit, but for the counterproductive attitude of successive United States administrations.
Putting aside the distortions that specific countries apply to their own model of communism as they integrate it into their own system, to what extent do you think that the seeds of destructions were already there in Marxism and Leninism?
I think that the seeds of destruction were there in Marxism and Leninism. Neither Marx nor Lenin seriously had a theory of political institutions. They didn't think about how accountability of politicians was necessary. I mean, they didn't think they were utopians, but they were utopians as well. They believed in this classless society of the future, full communism, in which everybody would somehow happily cooperate. But there was no consideration of how you would hold people to account, no interest in things like checks and balances or independent judiciary. So these faults were there from the very beginning in Marxism-Leninism. I think the systems also had the seeds of their own destruction in the sense that the educated people, a lot of these countries when they became communist were overwhelmingly peasant, overwhelmingly illiterate, and yet gradually the populations became better educated. And the more educated they became, the less satisfied they were with the censorship, not being able to read what books they wanted to read, not being able to see the films they wanted to see, not being able to travel abroad. So in that sense too, the systems contained the seeds of their own destruction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Se você quiser mais detalhes desta entrevista, acesse o blog do Milenio no site da Globo News. Sanar as falhas estruturais e prossegue sob tratamento intensivo, respirando com a ajuda de aparelhos. O comunismo tem sido o foco de estudos do historiador britânico Archie Brown há 40 anos, quase todos passados como professor da Universidade de Oxford. Autor de vários trabalhos sobre o assunto, inclusive 2 livros que focam o período reformista de Mikhail Gorbachev, Archie Brown acaba de lançar Ascensão e Queda do Comunismo, que em 720 páginas descreve e analisa o que o título promete, de Marx a Fidel. O Milenio entrevistou Archie Brown na sua casa em Oxford, interior da Inglaterra. Let's start at the end and deal with the political question that divides political analysts to this day. Did communism implode in the Soviet Union because de execução e suas impossibilidades teóricas? Em outras partes do mundo, 1/5 da humanidade ainda vive sob o comunismo, sobretudo por conta da populosa China, onde o partido com o monopólio do poder se diz comunista, embora a economia siga as leis do mercado. Essa forma diluída do regime, com economia capitalista, mas partido único que se diz marxista, também sobrevive no Vietnã e no Laos. Ao estilo totalitário, o comunismo revela seus piores defeitos na Coreia do Norte, onde penúria e fome da classe operária convivem com privilégios de um líder supremo tratado como Deus, um país ateu que se diz paraíso proletário. O comunismo sobrevive também em Cuba, em estilo tropical, repleto de jeitinhos latinos para saber. A ascensão e queda do comunismo foi um dos fenômenos históricos de maior impacto no século XX, com efeitos até hoje. Há pouco mais de 20 anos, metade da Europa era governada por partidos marxistas-leninistas. Agora, nenhum país europeu adota o sistema. E os partidos que defendem a ideologia mal conseguem adesões ou votos. O comunismo surgiu como promessa de utopia, arrastou-se como prática totalitária e implodiu como um prédio de fundações apodrecidas, debilitado por suas próprias contradições, seus erros.
I think a great deal depended on internal developments within the Soviet Communist Party. There was, of course, the attraction of the West, but it wasn't primarily pressure of military build-up that caused this change.
It broke up for internal reasons, to sum up.
Mainly for internal reasons, but the fact that the Soviet political elite, party intellectuals, travelled to the West and saw for themselves the difference in the standard of living and also the greater freedom of Western countries, this had an impact over time.
You have an interesting thesis. One of your main theses in your book is that Gorbachev chose to reform the country, the political side of communism, rather than the economic side, as the Chinese have been doing. And of internal problems. He was rotten, incapable of reforming, the economic situation was terrible, or did it happen under pressure from outside, especially military spending of the Americans, Star Wars programs of that kind? What was the main reason?
Well, there were so many reasons why communism ended when it did, but I don't think the main one was American military spending. Indeed, Reagan's arms build-up in his first term and his aggressive policy during that first term strengthened the hardliners in the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev didn't come to power because he was seen in any sense as a soft liner. He came to power because he was the youngest member of the Politburo and in the strongest position to succeed after the series of old men who had died in office. I